In fact, when I visited for election observation, one of the countries within the West African sub-region, I discovered that their citizens are not only voting in their elections, but they also have what they call overseas constituencies, where they elected representatives to their National Assembly. I was wondering when this kind of thing will happen in Nigeria, but it will happen. For us in INEC, we believe that this is good. Citizens should be given the opportunity. They are contributing wherever they are living, within or outside the country. And therefore, those who are living outside the country should be given the opportunity to vote. The challenge for us is to now identify those locations, to register them as voters, and then to find the best means by which they can exercise their franchise. But INEC is prepared for diaspora voting for as long as the legal framework is favorable for us to do so.
Now, are you also prepared for the elections involving 68, well, as at now, 68 political parties, because it was then pointed out to me that, yes, you had registered 68, but at that same event where you talked about registering 68, you also hinted that you had an additional 90 applications pending.
Out of which over a dozen are actually at the last stage of the registration process. So our projection is that we may, at present we have 68 political parties, but our projection is that by February 2019, we may have up to 80 political parties. Remember also the law says that any party registered 6 months to the election cannot participate in the election. But registration is a continuous process. So let us work on the 68 that we have.
The ballot paper, for example, someone asked me, and I said, if I get the opportunity, I will ask you. How is the ballot paper going to be?
The ballot paper is going to be customized, and that is what we have done. If a political party, for instance, is not filled in a candidate in an election, that the logo of the political party is not on the ballot paper.
And that will not be justification for later on bringing up a legal process.
No.
That you did not.
If a political party fills a candidate, and for whatever reason, the logo of the party is omitted from the ballot paper, then the provision of the law in that respect is very clear, that that amounts to unlawful exclusion, and the result of the election is nullified. So we're aware of that. So we will customize the ballot papers, but let's assume that all the 68 political parties are going to field candidates. And let us look at the number of constituencies into which we are going to conduct elections in 2019. 1 presidential constituency, 29 governorship constituencies, because election in 7 states is conducted off-season. We have done 5. We have 2 outstanding in Ekiti and Oshun in July and September. We have 109 senatorial constituencies. We have 360 federal constituencies. That is for election to the House of Representatives. We have 991 state constituencies. And then we have 68 constituencies in the FCT for the election of chairmen and councillors. It's just by coincidence that the election for chairmen and councillors coincides with the general election. So we decided that when citizens in other parts of the country are voting for their governors and members of state assembly, in the FCT they will vote for their chairmen and councillors, because there's no election to the office of governor and members of the state assembly in the FCT. So that will give you a total of 1,558 constituencies into which elections are conducted. Let us assume that 40 political parties field candidates will end up with 46,000 candidates for the election. You ask the question, how do you manage the ballot papers? We have gone very far, actually. We have produced dummy ballots. And we have one with 3 columns that can take more than 68 political parties. And it's manageable, because the next challenge will be, if you manage the ballot papers, how are you going to manage the ballot boxes? Because the papers have to be dropped into the ballot boxes. We have gone far with that. So far, we are comfortable with the preparations we are making for the election. But I wish to assure Nigerians that there will be massive sensitization and voter education around the size and nature of the ballot papers well ahead of the elections. In Anambra State, for instance, where we conducted the first election involving the participation of 37 political parties, We worked with IPAC, the Inter-Party Advisory Council, the civil society organizations, and people like you in the media to sensitize the citizens on the size of the ballot papers, which contain 37 political parties. So there's a history behind it. So we are going to engage big time with citizens on the nature of the ballot papers so that they can now identify the parties of their choice and vote in the election. The other dimension of it, which I have not raised, but which many citizens have raised, is INEC going to evolve a ballot access restriction policy so that not all political parties have access to the ballot. There is a provision already in the enabling laws that says that for a political party to remain registered, it has to win at least a seat at any level of the elections. But this is not a condition for registration. Okay. So for a political party that is registered afresh, then obviously it has to contest an election before you activate the provisions of the Constitution or the Electoral Act for representation. So in other words, we are going to go with a number of political parties that field candidates at any level in the election. But going by the arrangements we have put in place, we have no doubt that we can manage the number of political parties we have. But as I said earlier, we will do tremendous voter sensitization around the ballot paper so that citizens know exactly the nature of the ballot paper for 2019, which is obviously going to be bigger. Now, the law says that we should register political parties. INEC is a creation of the Constitution. It's a creation of the law. And we apply the law. We can't stop the registration of political parties simply because there are too many political parties. We will go by the provisions of the law, and that is what we'll continue to do. If we fail to do so, some of the associations will approach the courts, and the courts will order the commission to register them as political parties. In fact, some of the political parties that we registered were actually by orders of the courts. So we'll go by the provisions of the law in the registration of political parties.
Now, that brings me to something else, which is equally important, both for the commission and for the parties. In terms of the parties first, it is one of the duties of the commission to police their finances, check their audited accounts, ensure that they are not spending more than what the legal limits are for elections to. And this was one of the criticisms, and it's been enduring. It's been an enduring criticism that even if you start off from how much people buy nomination forms at the levels of the parties and so on, that it couldn't be possible that they are sticking to those limits. What is INEC doing in terms of strictly ensuring that the parties keep to the financial regulations governing their existence?
Well, there are two dimensions to your question. The first one is, I think 6 months after an election, it's in the Electoral Act, the party should render account of their spending in election to the commission. And I must say that many of the political parties are still yet to comply with the requirements of the law.
Would you stop them from contesting the next election?
No, the law does not say that we should stop. In fact, under Section 31(1) of the Electoral Act, INEC has no power to disqualify any candidate whose name is submitted to INEC for election. I don't think the punishment for failure to render accounts is either disqualifying the party from contesting election or stopping the candidate from presenting someone to represent it in an election. So that is one dimension of it, when the parties are supposed to now report to the commission. The other dimension is what you have said. I wouldn't like to use the word policing, but we are supposed to track financial spending by political parties.
Essentially, you are their police.
And it's very clear from the Electoral Act, the provisions are, if you are contesting for presidential, for instance, the maximum amount one can spend is 1 billion. You have candidate expenditure, you have political party expenditure. But how do you track this expenditure? If, for instance, you are a presidential candidate and you advertise on the pages of newspapers, we can get the advert rate, so we know how much a color advert in a particular newspaper costs. But most of the candidates will not say they are the ones placing the adverts. There are groups of friends, there are supporters, support groups, there are other associations. So it's actually very difficult to track finance expenditure.